Let me guess, you're lying there at night wondering who you would have been if they just let you be yourself. Not in some abstract philosophical way. I'm talking about the specific version of you that got buried. The one that wanted different things, felt different things, dreamed different things, before they told you what to want, what to feel, what to dream. Maybe you know this feeling, and you know it's not just regret. It's not just, I wish I'd made different choices. It's deeper than that. It's the haunting realization that you didn't get to make choices, because by the time you were old enough to choose, they had already decided who you were supposed to be, what you were supposed to want, what kind of life you were allowed to have. And you became that, not because you wanted to, but because that's what survival looked like. You see people now, people who were allowed to explore, to try things, to fail, to figure themselves out, and they seem whole in a way you've never felt, like they know who they are because nobody forced them to be someone else first. And you're still trying to untangle what's actually yours from what was installed in you before you had a choice. You tell yourself, what if they'd just let me be myself? What if I'd been allowed to try? What if I hadn't spent my entire childhood becoming what they needed instead of who I was? And the worst part is, you'll never know, because that version of you, the one that could have existed if they'd just let you alone, is gone. And you're left with this shape, this person you became to survive them, and you don't even know if any of it is real. I know this. I've lived it. I've spent years wondering who I would have been if I'd been allowed to want things they didn't approve of, if I'd been allowed to fail without it being a catastrophe, if I'd been allowed to just be. This isn't about blaming your parents. It's about what happens when your identity gets suppressed so early that you don't even know what's authentically you anymore, and why it feels like you're living a stolen life. Here's what this actually is, and it's not I had strict parents or I didn't get to do what I wanted as a kid. This is identity theft, except the thief was the person who was supposed to protect you. When you're a child, you don't have a fully formed self yet. Your raw potential, your curiosity, instinct, impulse. You're trying things, wanting things, being things, and through that exploration, you start to figure out who you are. But some of us didn't get that. Instead, we got messages, explicit and implicit, verbal and unspoken. Don't be too loud. Don't be too quiet. Don't want that. Want this instead. Don't feel that way. You're being dramatic. Don't act like that. People will think you're weird. Don't try that. You'll fail. Don't dream about that. It's not realistic. And if you heard that enough, you learned who you are isn't acceptable. So become someone else, not because they hated you, but because they were scared. Scared you'd make mistakes they couldn't fix. Scared you'd become someone they didn't recognize. Scared you'd want a life they didn't understand. So they clipped your wings before you even knew you had them. They told you who to be, and you became that, because children don't have a choice. Psychologists call this identity foreclosure. When you adopt an identity without exploring alternatives, when you become what others expect before you figure out what you actually want. But that clinical term doesn't capture what it does to you. It doesn't just limit you, it erases you. The real you, the one that could have existed, never gets the chance. And what's left is this constructed version, this person you built to survive their expectations, and you don't even know if any of it is yours. I knew someone who spent their entire childhood being told what to study, what to pursue, what kind of person to be. Smart, responsible, successful, the kind of kid who makes parents proud. So they became that. They buried everything else, the art they wanted to make, the risks they wanted to take, the version of themselves that didn't fit the plan. And now, decades later, they look at people who were allowed to fail, to explore, to be messy, and those people seem whole, like they know who they are because they were allowed to find out. And my friend, they're still trying to figure out what's actually theirs and what's just programming. And maybe that's you. Maybe you weren't allowed to be yourself, so you became what they needed, and now you're haunted by the ghost of who you could have been. Here's what happens when you grow up in a house where your identity isn't safe. You learn that being yourself has consequences. Maybe your parents needed you to be calm, so every time you were loud or energetic, you got shut down, told to settle down, told you were too much, so you learned excitement isn't safe, bury it. Or maybe they needed you to be strong, so every time you cried or felt scared, you got dismissed, told to toughen up, told feelings were weakness, so you learned vulnerability isn't allowed. Cut it off. Or maybe they had a plan for you, doctor, lawyer, engineer, whatever, and every time you showed interest in something else, they redirected you, told you it wasn't practical, told you to be realistic, so you learned your wants don't matter. Follow the script. Or maybe they just needed you to not be a problem, so you became small, quiet, easy. You stopped asking for things, stopped expressing things, stopped being things that might upset them. And none of this was malicious. They thought they were protecting you, guiding you, preparing you for a world they believed would punish you for being different. But what they actually did was cut off parts of you before you even knew they existed. Developmental psychology shows that children need space to explore identity, to try on different selves, to fail safely, to discover what resonates. When that exploration is suppressed, children develop what's called a false self, a persona built to meet external expectations rather than internal truth. And that false self becomes so integrated, so automatic, that by the time you're an adult, you can't tell where it ends and you begin. This is why you feel lost now, not because you don't know who you are, but because who you are might just be who they needed you to be, and you'll never know for sure. When you're living a life that might not be yours, you don't just feel confused. You develop voices, thoughts that loop, comparisons that bleed, questions that won't stop. The wondering one never shuts up. What if they'd let me try? What if I'd been allowed to fail? What if I'd been allowed to want things they didn't approve of? Who would I be right now? So you spend hours imagining alternate timelines, versions of your life where you were free. And here's what you don't say out loud. I think I would have been happier. I think I would have been more me, and I hate that I'll never know. The comparing one is relentless. Look at them. They were allowed to be themselves. They were allowed to explore. They seem whole in a way I've never felt. They know who they are because nobody told them who to be first. So you watch people who had freedom, who had space, who were allowed to be messy and figure it out. And the thought underneath, I feel robbed. They got to become themselves. I got programmed. The resentful one shows up when you're tired. They stole this from me. They cut my wings before I knew I had them. They decided who I'd be before I got a vote. And now I'm stuck with this shape they made. And when that voice gets loud, you feel anger, not at yourself, at them. But saying it feels ungrateful, cruel. So you bury it. And the buried thought, part of me will never forgive them for this. The confused one whispers constantly, I don't even know what's mine anymore. Do I actually want this? Or did they just tell me to want it so many times I believed them? Is any of this real? So you question everything, every preference, every goal, every part of your identity. Because you can't trust your own wants when you don't know if they were ever really yours. The dark truth. I don't know who I am. I might just be a person they built. The grief-stricken one appears late at night. I mourned a version of myself that never got to exist. The person I could have been if they just left me alone. And I'll never get them back. So you grieve someone who never lived, someone who only existed as potential before it got clipped. And what you think but won't say, I'm living a stolen life, and I don't know how to get it back because I don't even know what it would have looked like. And beneath all of them is the terrifying realization. What if there's nothing underneath? What if I peel back all the conditioning and there's just emptiness? What if they suppressed me so early that I never developed a real self at all? This doesn't stay theoretical, it bleeds into everything. Like last month, when someone asked what you're passionate about and you couldn't answer, not because you don't have interests, but because you genuinely don't know if your interests are yours or just things you were told to care about. Or last week, when you saw someone living unconventionally, traveling, creating, taking risks, and instead of feeling inspired, you felt bitter because they were allowed to try and you weren't. Or yesterday, when you made a choice and immediately second-guessed it, not because it was wrong, but because you can't tell if you actually wanted it or if you're just following the script they wrote for you decades ago. This is why you feel hollow sometimes, because you might be living someone else's idea of a good life, and it doesn't fit. This is why you resent people who seem authentic, because they got to become themselves, and you got shaped into something else before you had a chance. This is why you're haunted by what if, because you'll never know who you would have been if they just let you find out. Research on identity development shows that people who weren't allowed to explore in childhood often struggle with what's called identity diffusion in adulthood, a persistent sense of not knowing who they are, what they want, or what's authentically theirs. They spend decades trying to reverse engineer a self that was never allowed to form naturally. Here's something that might reframe this, and it's not comforting, it's just true. You can't get back the person you would have been. That version is gone. The life you could have lived if they'd left you alone, it doesn't exist, and it never will. And yeah, that's brutal, but staying stuck in the what if keeps you from building something real now. Because here's the thing, you're not that child anymore. You're not powerless. You're not trapped in their house, living by their rules, becoming what they need. You're an adult, and adults get to choose. Not perfectly, not without consequences, but you get to choose. You can start trying things they never let you try. You can explore parts of yourself that got buried. You can question every single thing you were told to want and decide for the first time if it's actually yours. And yeah, it's late. Yeah, you lost time. Yeah, other people got a head start because they were allowed to be themselves from the beginning. But starting late is still starting, and reverse engineering your identity is still building one. The person you could have been is gone, but the person you could become, if you finally give yourself permission, is still possible. You can keep mourning the stolen life, keep comparing yourself to people who were free, keep wondering who you would have been if they just let you be, or you can start building who you are now, not who you would have been, who you can still become. You can try the things they never let you try. You can feel the things they told you not to feel. You can want the things they said weren't realistic. You can give yourself the permission they never gave you. And yeah, it's going to feel wrong at first, like you're betraying them, like you're being selfish, like you don't deserve it because you should have figured this out earlier. But those are their voices, not yours. And maybe, for the first time, you can start listening to the voice underneath, the one that got buried, the one that's still there, waiting. Imagine this. You're standing in front of a mirror, and in the reflection, you see the child you were, small, curious, full of potential. And behind that child, you see them, your parents, holding scissors, not with malice, with fear, with love, with the belief that clipping your wings would keep you safe. And you watch as they cut, and the child doesn't fight, because children don't know they're supposed to. But you're not that child anymore, and the wings they cut, they can grow back. Not the same ones, not the life you would have had, but something new, something yours, if you let them. If you're haunted by who you could have been, if you feel like you're living a life that was chosen for you, you're not alone. A lot of us are still trying to figure out what's ours. If you need to talk about it, I'm here.